Commander Zekthor stood in front of the large screen on his ship and stared at the small blue planet floating in the darkness of space. His 3 eyes moved across the data that appeared on the display, and none of it made any sense to him. 7 fleets had gone to that world, and 7 fleets had disappeared without sending even a single message back to the Foxian collective. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, and the readings showed a civilization that should have been easy to conquer. The beings who lived there called themselves humans, and they had barely reached their own moon with their primitive spacecraft. Their world was divided into hundreds of different groups that fought each other constantly. They had no shields protecting their planet and no weapons platforms floating in orbit around their world. By every measurement the collective used to judge other species, humans should have surrendered within days of seeing Voxian ships. But something had gone terribly wrong, and Zekthor needed to understand what that something was before he made his next move. His tactical officer Riendak stood beside him and looked just as confused as Zekthor felt. Riendak had been analyzing the data for 3 days straight and had found nothing that explained why 7 entire fleets had vanished. Zekthor made a decision and ordered his crew to stay at the edge of the solar system. While he sent small observation drones toward the planet, he wanted to watch the humans without them knowing they were being watched. The drones moved silently through space and began collecting information from the planet's communication networks. Humans broadcasted everything, and the drones easily intercepted millions of messages, videos, and data files. What the drones discovered made Zekthor's blood run cold in his veins. The humans documented everything about their history, and their documents showed thousands of years of constant warfare. These beings had been fighting each other since they learned to make tools and weapons. They had fought with rocks and sticks at first, then with metal swords and arrows, then with guns and explosives, and finally with weapons so powerful they could destroy entire cities in seconds. Riendak pulled up a video file and played it on the main screen. Zekthor watched human soldiers moving through a ruined city with careful precision. They communicated with hand signals and short-coded phrases. They moved from building to building while checking every corner and doorway. These were not the clumsy primitives that the collective's reports had described. These were trained warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. The video changed to show massive human machines rolling across open ground, while smaller vehicles flew overhead. Explosions erupted around them, but the humans kept advancing. Some of their vehicles were destroyed, but the others kept moving forward like they didn't care about the losses. Zekthor had seen many species fight, but he had never seen anything like this combination of discipline and aggressive determination. Riendak brought up more information and explained that the video came from something humans called World War II. That conflict had happened almost 100 years before and involved most of the nations on the planet fighting each other. The war had killed over 60 million humans and destroyed countless cities. Yet humanity had recovered from that devastation and built themselves back up to be stronger than before. Thor asked how many wars humans had fought in their history, and Riendak didn't have an exact number because there were too many to count. Some human nations had been at war for decades without stopping. Other nations had fought brief conflicts that ended quickly. But the pattern was clear. Humans fought constantly, and they were very good at it. The next piece of information disturbed Zekthor even more than the battle footage. Humans had developed weapons called nuclear bombs that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion. 9 different human nations possessed these weapons, and they had enough of them to destroy their own planet several times over. They had created these weapons while they were still confined to their single world, and they had somehow managed not to use them for decades. This fact troubled Zekthor deeply because it showed that humans understood restraint. They could destroy themselves completely, but they chose not to. That kind of self-control required intelligence and strategic thinking that the collective had not anticipated. Any species that could create such destructive weapons and then choose not to use them was far more sophisticated than initial reports suggested. Doc continued analyzing human culture and found that their entertainment was filled with stories about warfare. They watched movies and read books about soldiers fighting against impossible odds. They played games where they simulated battles and tested different strategies. They seemed to enjoy thinking about combat and conflict even when they weren't actually fighting. The most troubling discovery came when Riendak found references to the missing Foxian fleets buried in classified human military files. The humans had detected every single fleet that approached their planet, and they had responded with coordinated military action. Multiple human nations that normally competed with each other had formed temporary alliances within hours of detecting Voxian ships. They had deployed weapons that shouldn't have existed yet and destroyed every vessel that came near their world. The last fleet to disappear had been detected 6 hours before reaching Earth's orbit, and in those 6 hours the humans had scrambled thousands of aircraft and activated defense systems across their entire planet. They had prepared nuclear countermeasures and positioned satellites to track every Voxian ship. The human military had called it Operation Guardian Shield, and it had worked perfectly. Zekthor realized with growing horror that the humans had not only destroyed the Voxian ships, but they had also kept the incident secret from their own population. They had hidden the evidence to prevent panic among civilians, while their military forces reverse-engineered Voxian technology. Each fleet that the collective sent had made humanity stronger, because they studied the wreckage and learned from it. The data showed that humans had already built prototype ships using adapted Voxian engines. They had created new weapons based on collective designs. They had done in months what should have taken them decades, and they had done it all while pretending to still be primitive. This was not luck or accident. This was deliberate deception and strategic planning. Zekthor made his decision and ordered his fleet to power down all weapons and prepare to leave the solar system. Reendak looked shocked and asked why they were retreating. Zekthor explained that humanity was too dangerous to fight and too clever to underestimate. Every fleet sent to Earth made them stronger and more prepared. The only way to win against humans was to not fight them at all. But Zekthor's decision came 3 seconds too late. A massive human ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly behind the Voxian command vessel. The ship looked like nothing Zekthor had ever seen before. It combined human engineering with adapted Voxian technology into something entirely new. The vessel bristled with weapons, and 3 more identical ships appeared around the collective fleet in a perfect tactical formation. A human voice spoke in perfect Voxian language through the communication system, and the voice belonged to someone who identified himself as Captain Jack Morrison. He informed Zekthor that the Voxian vessels were in violation of human territorial space and needed to power down their weapons immediately or face destruction. The human captain gave them 30 seconds to comply. Zekthor looked at his crew and thought about their families waiting for them back home. He thought about the 7 fleets that had come before and never returned. He thought about the battle footage showing human determination and the weapons they had reverse-engineered from captured Voxian technology. Pride wasn't worth dying for, and conquest wasn't worth losing everything. He ordered his crew to power down all weapons and prepare for boarding. Human soldiers in advanced combat armor appeared on his bridge through some kind of teleportation technology that the collective didn't possess. They moved with military precision and secured the bridge within seconds. Zekthor raised his hands in surrender and watched as his crew did the same. As the human soldiers secured the ship, Zekthor understood something that terrified him more than anything else. Humanity hadn't reached the stars yet because they were too busy fighting each other and developing weapons to use against themselves. But now they knew they weren't alone in the universe. Now they had a common enemy that wasn't human. Now they had a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting together. That changed everything. Lieutenant Commander Julie Parker walked through the corridors of the USS Defender and tried to prepare herself for what was about to happen. She had trained for years to handle first contact situations, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the reality of standing face to face with an actual alien being from another world. The Voxian prisoners were being held in secure cells, and she had been chosen to lead the interrogation team because of her background in psychology and linguistics. Sergeant Kevin Hayes met her outside the interrogation room and handed her a datapad with all the information they had gathered so far about Commander Zekthor. The alien commander had surrendered without firing a shot, which suggested he was intelligent enough to know when he was beaten. Julie hoped that intelligence would make him willing to talk and share information about the Voxian collective. The interrogation room had been converted from a storage bay and equipped with translation software that could turn Voxian speech into English and vice versa. Zekthor sat behind a transparent barrier, and his 3 eyes tracked Julie as she entered the room and took a seat across from him. She studied him carefully, and noticed that he seemed calm rather than frightened or angry. Julie introduced herself and explained that humans were not going to torture or harm any of the Voxian prisoners. Zekthor responded by saying that this contradicted everything his intelligence reports had said about human behavior. Julie admitted that humans had done terrible things to each other throughout their history, but explained that they had learned from those mistakes. The fact that they were talking instead of spacing the prisoners proved that humans could show mercy. Zekthor asked why he was still alive, and Julie gave him a direct answer. Humans wanted to understand why the Voxian collective kept sending fleets to Earth. Maybe if both sides understood each other better, they could avoid more bloodshed. She asked how many more fleets the collective would send before they realized that conquering Earth was going to cost too much. The alien commander seemed surprised by the question and asked if humans really wanted to negotiate. Julie corrected him and explained that humans wanted to be left alone, but if that wasn't possible, then at least they could try to reach some kind of understanding. She asked Zekthor to tell her about the collective and explain why they were trying to expand into human territory. Over the next several hours, Zekthor described the structure and goals of the Voxian collective. The collective wasn't purely aggressive like humans might think. They absorbed other species into their society and offered them protection and advanced technology in exchange for resources and loyalty. Most species accepted this arrangement willingly after the collective demonstrated their superior military power. Julie asked if the collective had ever encountered species that refused to join, and Zekthor confirmed that it had happened twice before. The Crethon species had fought for 3 years before being conquered. The Yaloon species had required orbital bombardment of 2 continents before they surrendered. Both of those species had been more technologically advanced than humanity when the collective found them. Julie pointed out that both species had fallen, but Earth had not. Zekthor agreed and explained that humans were different from any other species the collective had encountered. The Crethon had been strong, but they couldn't adapt when their strategies failed. The Yaloon had been clever, but their divided nature made them weak. Humans combined strength with adaptability, and they never stopped fighting even when defeat seemed certain. The alien commander said he had studied human history after the 5th Voxian fleet disappeared, and he had been particularly fascinated by something humans called World War II. He described it as 2 massive alliances locked in total conflict while constantly developing new weapons and tactics. The war had only ended when one side deployed weapons capable of destroying entire cities instantly. Yet despite having these terrible weapons, humans had not used them since that war ended. Julie explained the concept of mutually assured destruction and how humans had learned that some weapons were too terrible to ever use again. But she also made it clear that this didn't mean humans wouldn't use those weapons if they had no other choice. If the collective forced humanity into a corner, they would launch everything they had. Zekthor asked if that was a threat, and Julie told him it was simply a statement of fact. If more Voxian fleets came to Earth, they would be destroyed just like the previous 7. If the collective sent ground forces, humans would fight in every city and forest and mountain on the planet. If the collective tried orbital bombardment, humans would launch their nuclear weapons at collective staging areas. And if somehow the collective managed to conquer Earth, humans would resist for generations until they eventually overthrew their oppressors. The alien commander sat quietly for a long moment before saying that humans would rather die than submit to foreign rule. Julie confirmed this without hesitation and explained that this attitude was encoded in human culture and history and identity. It wasn't false bravado or empty courage. Humans genuinely preferred death over slavery. Julie pulled up images on her datapad and showed them to Zekthor through the barrier. She showed him the Battle of Stalingrad, where human soldiers fought for months in a surrounded city that was slowly being destroyed around them. She showed him the Battle of Britain, where an island nation facing superior enemy forces chose to fight instead of surrendering. She showed him Valley Forge and Thermopylae and dozens of other battles where humans had faced impossible odds. She asked Zekthor if he could see the pattern in all these historical battles. Humans didn't calculate odds the same way other species did. They didn't surrender just because logic suggested they should. They fought because fighting was fundamental to who and what they were as a species. She explained that this made humans extremely dangerous opponents because they would never quit. Meanwhile, on Earth, President Helen Crawford sat in a secure room deep beneath the White House, surrounded by military advisors and intelligence officers. They were watching holographic displays showing the captured Voxian fleet in orbit and discussing what should happen next. Some advisors wanted to prepare for total war, while others thought humanity should try to negotiate a peaceful resolution. General Peter Walsh argued that Earth needed every defense system on full alert and ready to fight. He wanted to activate secret orbital weapons platforms and recall all military personnel to active duty. If the collective wanted a war, then humanity would give them one they would never forget. Secretary of State Frank Butler asked what would happen with diplomatic negotiations, and President Crawford explained that humans would negotiate from a position of strength. Commander Zekthor seemed rational based on Julie's reports, and maybe he could be convinced that attacking Earth would cost more than it was worth. If the collective could be persuaded to leave humanity alone, then war could be avoided. Admiral Karen Ross asked what would happen if negotiations failed, and President Crawford's expression became hard. If diplomacy didn't work, then humanity would show the galaxy exactly why no one returned from Earth. Humans had reverse-engineered 7 fleets worth of alien technology and built weapons the collective had never encountered. Earth had 4 billion people ready to defend their homeworld. Back on the USS Defender, Julie continued her interrogation of Zekthor. She asked him directly what he wanted from this situation, and the alien commander gave her an honest answer. He wanted to go home. He wanted his crew to survive. He wanted to stop fighting a war that couldn't be won. Julie leaned forward and told him that he could have all of those things. Humans would release him and his crew unharmed with their ships intact. All he had to do in return was deliver a message to the Voxian collective and convince them to leave Earth alone. If the collective refused to listen and sent more fleets, those fleets would find debris fields instead of captured ships. Zekthor asked what guarantee he had that humans would actually release him, and Julie replied with a simple answer. Her word and the word of her government. She admitted it wasn't much, but it was all she could offer. The alternative was that Zekthor remained a prisoner while the collective sent more fleets that would be destroyed. The alien commander thought about this for several minutes before finally agreeing to deliver the human message. Julie felt relief wash over her, but she also felt worried because she knew this was just the beginning. Even if Zekthor convinced the collective to negotiate, there would be other challenges ahead. Other species would hear about what happened, and some of them might decide to test humanity themselves. But for now, Julie had accomplished her mission. She had opened a dialogue with an alien species and possibly prevented more bloodshed. As she left the interrogation room, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity could find a way to survive in a galaxy full of dangers. The Voxian High Command chamber was enormous and circular, with walls covered in screens, displaying information from across the collective's vast territory. 9 high commanders sat on elevated thrones in the dim lighting, and their forms were barely visible from the floor below. Commander Zekthor stood in the center of the room wearing his formal uniform and trying not to show how nervous he felt. A commander who had lost his entire fleet should have been executed immediately, but instead he had been summoned to explain himself to the highest authority in the collective. High Commander Vexnall spoke first, and his voice echoed through the chamber. He told Zekthor to explain what had happened in the Sol system and why he had returned with such disturbing reports. Zekthor activated his personal display and showed footage captured during his fleet's encounter with human warships. He explained that humanity represented a threat unlike anything the collective had faced during their expansion across the galaxy. Another high commander, named Telvash, laughed at this statement and said that humans barely had interstellar capability. Intelligence reports showed that humanity was still a fractured species fighting among themselves. Telvash couldn't understand how such a primitive civilization could be considered a threat to the mighty collective. Zekthor responded carefully and explained that their intelligence reports were outdated and dangerously incomplete. He asked permission to present evidence, and Vexnall gestured for him to continue. Zekthor showed the human warships that had intercepted his fleet and pointed out how they incorporated Voxian technology with disturbing efficiency. He displayed combat footage from human history showing their capacity for violence and innovation when facing pressure. The assembled commanders watched as Zekthor explained how humans had evolved as persistence hunters who chased their prey across vast distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. This evolutionary history had shaped human psychology in ways the collective had failed to understand. Humans didn't acknowledge defeat the way other species did. They didn't calculate acceptable losses and surrender when the odds turned against them. They fought until they won, or until they physically couldn't continue anymore. The footage showed human soldiers moving through dangerous territory with practiced precision. Zekthor highlighted moments where humans chose to rescue wounded companions instead of abandoning them. He showed small units holding positions against overwhelming enemy numbers. He showed individuals sacrificing themselves to save others. Telvash observed that this emotional attachment made humans predictable and therefore weak. Zekthor disagreed respectfully and explained that human emotions made them more dangerous rather than less. A human soldier who knew his companions would never abandon him fought with far greater effectiveness than a soldier who expected to be left behind. These emotional bonds created military units that functioned with remarkable coordination and determination. He pulled up more data showing Earth's industrial capacity and explained that after each Voxian scouting mission, humans had reverse-engineered collective technology. Within months, they had incorporated alien systems into their own designs. They had built warships and orbital platforms and weapons that shouldn't have existed yet. They had done all of this while maintaining the illusion that they were still primitive and defenseless. Vexenal asked if Zekthor was suggesting that humans had deliberately deceived the collective. Zekthor confirmed this and added that humans were strategically sophisticated beyond initial assessments. They had been preparing for extraterrestrial contact for decades through their entertainment media and military planning. When Voxian ships finally arrived, humanity had been ready and waiting. Zekthor took a deep breath before making his recommendation. He suggested that the collective should classify the Sol system as prohibited territory and never attempt contact with humanity again. The chamber erupted in angry arguments. Some commanders demanded immediate retaliation for the loss of 7 fleets. Others questioned Zekthor's courage and suggested that fear had clouded his judgment. Only Vexenal remained silent while studying the data with intense focus. Vexenal commanded silence and the chamber instantly obeyed. He told Zekthor to play the message that humans had sent. Zekthor activated the recording and the hologram shifted to show Julie Parker, sitting in what appeared to be a military vessel. Her expression looked calm and professional, but her eyes held an intensity that made several commanders shift uncomfortably in their seats. Julie's translated voice began speaking, and she identified herself as Lieutenant Commander Julie Parker of the United Earth Defense Force. She said she was speaking on behalf of all humanity with a simple message for the collective leadership: leave us alone. She paused to let those words sink in before continuing. Julie explained that humans knew the collective had conquered 42 worlds and believed adding Earth to that list was inevitable. She was here to explain why that belief was completely wrong. The hologram expanded to show images of Earth, with its cities and landscapes and billions of humans living their daily lives. Julie stated that humanity was not a unified species, but they were absolutely a determined one. Humans had fought wars that devastated entire continents. They had created weapons capable of making their planet uninhabitable. They had chosen not to use those weapons because they understood restraint. But if the collective forced humanity to choose between submission and destruction, humans would choose destruction every single time without hesitation. She leaned forward in the recording, and her gaze seemed to look directly at the commanders, despite the recording being weeks old. She pointed out that the collective had lost 7 fleets in human territory, and that wasn't luck. It was a deliberate warning. Humans had captured Voxian vessels and studied their technology and learned collective tactics. Every time the collective sent ships to Earth, they made humanity stronger. They were essentially training their own future enemy. The image shifted to show human military forces, including massive armies and naval fleets and aircraft carriers. Submarines lurked in dark waters while fighter jets screamed across the sky. Julie's voice explained that this was what humans did to each other during their conflicts. She asked the commanders to imagine what humanity would do to an alien invasion force. More images followed, showing nuclear explosions and ruined cities and soldiers fighting in every terrain imaginable. Julie stated that humans didn't want war with the collective. They wanted peace. They wanted to be left alone to develop at their own pace and solve their own problems and find their own path to the stars. If the collective respected that desire, then humans and Voxians could coexist peacefully. They might even become allies someday in the future, but Julie's expression hardened as she delivered the warning. If the collective came to conquer Earth, if they threatened human families and freedom, then humanity would fight back with every weapon they possessed. They would use every tactic learned from 10,000 years of constant warfare. They would employ every ounce of human stubbornness that had kept them alive through ice ages and plagues and countless disasters. Humans would make the collective regret the day they ever pointed their sensors at the Sol system. Julie stood and the camera followed her movement. She explained that this was the only warning the collective would receive. The next fleet they sent wouldn't find captured ships and imprisoned crews. They would find debris fields and warning beacons broadcasting what happens to those who threaten humanity. The fleet after that would meet the same fate, and every fleet after that until the collective finally understood what humans had been trying to tell them all along. Julie's final words were clear and uncompromising. Humans don't quit, they don't surrender. And they absolutely do not accept conquest under any circumstances. The recording ended with Julie saluting in a gesture that combined respect with defiance. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after the message finished playing. Telvash finally spoke and dismissed Julie's words as empty posturing. He argued that human technology was still inferior, and with sufficient force the collective could overwhelm their defenses. Zekthor asked how many more fleets Telvash was willing to sacrifice. They had already lost 7 fleets. Even if they eventually conquered Earth, what would come next? Humans had extensive historical records of fighting, guerrilla wars against occupying forces, and they were exceptionally skilled at it. Another commander suggested completely destroying humanity through orbital bombardment until nothing remained alive on the planet. Vexnal pointed out that such an operation would require the entire collective fleet, which would leave their other territories vulnerable to attack. Moreover, it would consume resources equivalent to conquering 3 normal worlds. And what would they gain? A dead planet whose inhabitants had already proven they could adapt collective technology faster than anyone anticipated. Vexnal stood slowly, and his ancient form moved with deliberate care. He announced that he had studied humanity extensively since receiving Zekthor's initial reports. This species was an anomaly that should have destroyed itself centuries ago, with their weapons and conflicts. Instead, they had grown stronger and more resilient with each challenge. They had turned their capacity for violence into a defensive asset that the United Nations Security Council chamber had never been so crowded with representatives from every nation on Earth, packed into the room, and thousands more watching through secure video feeds. The future of humanity would be decided in this place, and everyone wanted to have their voice heard. President Helen Crawford stood at the podium, and her face showed the weight of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Lieutenant Commander. Julie Parker stood beside her at attention after being recalled from the USS Defender to brief the assembled world leaders. Helen began speaking, and her voice was amplified across the chamber. She announced that 3 days ago humanity had received a transmission from the Voxian Collective. Commander Zekthor had returned to Earth's solar system, but this time he didn't bring an invasion force. Instead, he brought a diplomatic proposal that could change everything. The chamber erupted in confused conversation, and Helen waited for silence before continuing. She explained that the collective was offering humanity a treaty. They would designate the Sol system as sovereign human territory, and no collective vessels would be allowed to enter without permission. In exchange, humanity would agree to remain within their own solar system for the next 50 years, while they continued developing their technology and society. Ambassador Chen from the Chinese delegation shouted that 50 years was 2 entire generations. He argued that humanity would be caging themselves while the collective surrounded them and prepared for invasion. Julie spoke up in a calm but firm voice and explained that the offer was actually remarkably generous. In 50 years, at humanity's current rate of technological development, Earth would be advanced enough to interact with the collective on equal terms. The aliens were essentially giving humans time to catch up. Ambassador Petrov from Russia countered that 50 years might also be the time the collective needed to prepare their forces for a real invasion. Julie responded that she had spoken extensively with Commander Zekthor, and her analysis suggested the collective leadership was genuinely concerned about the cost of conquering Earth. Humanity had proven itself too dangerous to be worth the casualties. General Peter Walsh stood from his seat and emphasized the military implications of the treaty. Earth had captured 7 fleets worth of alien technology. In 50 years, humanity could build a defensive force capable of holding off any invasion attempt. But that would only be possible if they used the time wisely instead of wasting it on continued conflicts among themselves. Prime Minister James Cooper from the United Kingdom asked what would happen if humanity rejected the treaty offer. Helen's expression darkened, and she explained that rejection would likely mean continued conflict. More Voxian fleets would come, and humanity would be forced to divert resources to defense instead of development. Earth would exist in a constant state of war and would be unable to focus on advancement and growth. Ambassador LeBlanc from France observed that some people argued war actually drives innovation and makes civilization stronger. Julie agreed that war does drive technological development, but she pointed out that war also kills millions of people. She had studied the collective's military capacity extensively. If the Voxians committed fully to conquering Earth, humanity might be able to hold them off, but the cost would be absolutely catastrophic. Cities would be destroyed, and populations would be displaced, and Earth would need decades just to recover from the damage. Julie pulled up holographic projections showing various scenarios that might unfold. She explained that if humanity accepted the treaty, they would get peace. They would have time to unify and solve their internal conflicts and build a true planetary defense force. They would have time to become the species they needed to be before facing the dangers of the galaxy. Ambassador Okonkwo from Nigeria raised an important question that everyone had been thinking about. She asked who would decide how humanity spent those 50 years. Would nations continue operating separately, or would Earth form a unified government? The question created tension in the room because it touched on the real issue underlying everything else. First contact with aliens had forced humanity to confront its divisions and decide what kind of species they wanted to be. Helen answered carefully and explained that the treaty didn't require political unity. It only required that humanity respect the territorial boundaries of the Sol system. How humans organized themselves internally was their own choice to make. The collective didn't care if Earth had 1 government or 200 governments as long as humanity honored the treaty terms. Ambassador Singh from India made a bold suggestion. She proposed that every nation should hold a referendum and let their citizens vote on whether to accept or reject the treaty. Every human on Earth should have a voice in deciding their species' fate. The chamber erupted again, but this time with genuine consideration instead of argument. The idea was unprecedented, but it felt right somehow. This decision was too important to be made by politicians alone. Ambassador Chen protested that organizing a global vote would take months. Helen responded that humanity had time because Commander Zekthor had agreed to wait for their answer. The alien commander understood that humans needed to reach consensus, and he was willing to be patient. While diplomatic debates continued on Earth, Commander Zekthor sat in his vessel anchored at the edge of the solar system. His crew monitored Earth's communications and translated the flood of human discussions about the treaty. Riendick observed that humans were arguing about everything, including how to vote, and what the vote meant, and whether they even needed a vote. He had never seen a species so disorganized in his entire life. Zekthor corrected his officer and explained that humans weren't disorganized. They were democratic. Every individual wanted their voice to be heard in important decisions. The process was inefficient compared to the collective's hierarchical system, but it ensured broader acceptance of whatever decision was finally made. Riendak asked if Thor thought humans would accept the treaty. The commander studied the data streams flowing from Earth and said he believed they would. Humans were aggressive when threatened, but they weren't foolish. They understood that 50 years of peace was worth far more than 50 years of constant warfare. On Earth, the debate continued for weeks. Media outlets broadcast endless discussions and analysis. Internet forums exploded with millions of opinions from ordinary citizens. Protesters gathered in major cities, with some demanding acceptance of the treaty, while others insisted humanity should never negotiate with potential invaders. Julie found herself giving interviews and explaining the collective's offer to millions of viewers around the world. She tried to be completely honest about both the opportunities and the risks involved. She told people that accepting the treaty wasn't surrender, it was strategy, Humanity would be buying time to grow stronger and solve their problems and become ready for what waited out there among the stars. One interviewer asked if humans could trust the Voxians to honor the treaty. Julie turned the question around and asked if the Voxians could trust humanity. She pointed out that Earth had destroyed 7 collective fleets and proven that humans were dangerous. The treaty protected the collective from humanity, just as much as it protected humanity from the collective. The global referendum was scheduled for 60 days after the initial announcement. Every nation on Earth participated using whatever voting systems they had in place. The process was messy and chaotic and utterly human in its complexity. Lieutenant Commander Danny Torres watched the vote returns come in from the USS Defender's observation deck. He commented that the results were going to be close. Julie stood beside him and said the vote shouldn't be close at all. Accepting the treaty was obviously the smart choice for humanity's future. Danny smiled and reminded her that humans weren't always smart. They were emotional and proud and stubborn. Those traits made them excellent fighters but terrible diplomats. Julie suggested that maybe it was time for humanity to get better at diplomacy instead of just warfare. Danny agreed but pointed out that changing human nature wasn't going to happen overnight. The final results came in on a Tuesday morning measured by Earth time. President Helen Crawford appeared on every screen across the planet simultaneously to announce the outcome. She addressed all of humanity, and her voice remained steady despite the historic importance of the moment. Helen announced that the votes had been counted and verified. By a margin of 62% to 38%, humanity had chosen to accept the Voxian Collective's treaty offer. Cheers erupted in some locations while protests started in others. Helen continued speaking over the noise and explained what the decision meant. She emphasized that accepting the treaty didn't mean giving up independence or the determination to defend Earth. It meant being smart about humanity's future. For the next 50 years, Earth would focus on unity and development and preparation. When humans finally ventured beyond their solar system, they would do so as a true, spacefaring species ready to take their place among the stars. Helen looked directly into the cameras and addressed the Voxian Collective. She stated that humanity accepted their offer and would honor the treaty terms. She expected the collective to do the same. Then she spoke to all humans and told them to use these 50 Yi. 25 years had passed since the treaty was signed, and Lieutenant Commander Julie Parker was now Admiral Parker, standing in the observation deck of Earth's largest orbital station. She watched construction crews finish the latest addition to humanity's defensive network, while thinking about everything that had changed in a quarter century. The station was named Unity, and it represented everything humans had accomplished during their years of peace. Sleek warships sat in docking bays with their hulls incorporating human engineering combined with adapted alien technology. Diplomatic vessels prepared for missions to neutral trading posts where humans had begun cautiously interacting with other species. Science vessels readied themselves for exploration missions to the outer edges of the solar system. Admiral Danny Torres joined her at the viewport and commented that the sight was impressive. Julie agreed and said it was hard to believe humanity had built all of this in just 25 years. Danny reminded her that necessity was a powerful motivator, and not having to fight constant wars helped free up tremendous resources for development. Julie asked about the Mars colony, and Danny reported that the population had just reached 2 million people. The moon bases were thriving as well. Earth now had serious industrial capacity off-world, which meant that any invader would have to fight for every planet and moon and asteroid base in the system. Danny asked if Julie still thought someone would eventually try to invade despite the treaty. Julie said maybe not the Voxians because Zekthor had been a good partner, but there were other species out there. Some of them might not be as reasonable as the collective had proven to be. Through carefully negotiated information exchanges with the Voxians, humanity had learned much about the galaxy during these peaceful years. Earth now had basic star charts and knowledge of dozens of alien species and understanding of galactic politics. The galaxy was far more complicated than humans had imagined when they first encountered Zekthor's fleet. The Voxian Collective was just one of several major powers competing for influence. There was the Crethon Empire, still bitter about their own subjugation by the Collective. The Federation of Free Worlds was a loose alliance of species who had successfully resisted various conquerors. The merchant guilds controlled most trade routes between systems. Dozens of independent species tried to navigate carefully between the major powers. Humanity's emergence had disrupted the delicate balance of galactic politics. Word had spread about the species that forced the mighty collective to negotiate, rather than conquer. Some species saw humans as potential allies who might help them maintain their own independence. Others viewed humanity as dangerous wildcards who needed to be contained before they grew too powerful. Danny mentioned that Ambassador Rodriguez reported good progress with the Free Worlds delegation. They were interested in cultural exchange programs with Earth. Julie said that was smart because the Free Worlds could teach humanity a lot about maintaining independence in a crowded galaxy. Danny added that humans could teach them about unified defense strategies because apparently humanity's military coordination had impressed many species. Julie laughed and pointed out that humans had spent centuries fighting each other, so they had gotten very good at warfare. All that experience was finally being put to better use. On Earth, President David Kim addressed the General Assembly about the progress humanity had made. He was Helen Crawford's successor, and he had inherited a world transformed by 25 years of the long peace wars. Hadn't entirely disappeared from Earth, but conflicts had become smaller and were resolved much faster. The existence of external threats had helped humanity recognize how wasteful fighting each other truly was. David told the assembled leaders that humanity had achieved remarkable things during the treaty period. Carbon emissions were down 60% from their peak. Renewable energy now powered 80% of human civilization. Poverty had been reduced by half across the planet. Education and healthcare were available to 90% of humanity. He gestured to displays showing orbital stations and moon bases and cities on Mars. David emphasized that humans had expanded beyond Earth without abandoning their homeworld. They had learned to live sustainably while growing their capabilities. They had done all of this while maintaining their independence and celebrating their diversity. But he acknowledged that challenges remained because not all humans had embraced the changes that came. With the long peace nationalist movements in various countries resisted the increasing cooperation between nations. Some religious groups struggled with the knowledge that humans weren't alone in the universe. Economic disruptions from new technologies had created winners and losers, which led to social tensions. David reminded everyone that they had 25 years left in the treaty period. They had 25 more years to finish the work they had started, and truly unify not by erasing differences, but by learning to celebrate them while working toward common goals. Aboard Commander, Zekthor's vessel now permanently assigned as the collective's liaison to the Sol system, the old commander reviewed reports with his young aide named Teshka. She observed that humanity's military capacity had increased exponentially over the years. They now had 42 capital ships and 200 fighters and extensive orbital defenses and ground forces, numbering in the millions. Zekthor pointed out that all of it was defensive in nature. Humanity had honored the treaty completely. No human ships had left the Sol system except for pre-approved diplomatic missions to neutral space. Teshka said that humans could launch an invasion force in a matter of days if they wanted to. Zekthor agreed but said they wouldn't unless someone provoked them. That was what the High Command still didn't fully understand about humans. They weren't naturally aggressive. They were naturally defensive. They only fought when threatened or when protecting something they cared about. Teshka mentioned that some commanders still argued the collective should have conquered Earth when they had the chance. Zekthor turned to look at his aide and said they never had the chance. Every fleet sent to Earth had made humans stronger and more prepared. If the collective had continued sending fleets, they would have eventually lost so many ships that their other territories would have become vulnerable. The High Command had made the right choice. Teshka reported that Krethon ambassadors claimed humanity represented a threat to galactic stability. Zekthor said the Krethon were bitter about their own defeat, and they saw in humanity what they wished they had been. Strong enough to resist conquest and maintain independence. Teshka pulled up data showing increased human communications with the free worlds. Intelligence suggested they were forming deeper relationships than simple cultural exchange. Zekthor said that was good because the free worlds would be excellent for humanity. They would help humans navigate galactic politics without losing their independence or compromising their values. Teshka seemed surprised that Zekthor sounded like he admired humans. The commander said he respected them and there was a difference. 25 years ago, he had thought humans were dangerous primitives who needed to be controlled. Now he thought they might be exactly what the galaxy needed to shake up the old power structures. Teshka asked what he meant, and Zekthor explained that every major power in the galaxy had achieved their position through conquest or coercion. The Collective and the Crethon and even the merchant guilds had all forced others to bend to their will. Humans were different. They fought when necessary, but they preferred cooperation. They competed fiercely among themselves, but they united when facing external threats. They might show the galaxy a better way forward. Back on Unity Station, Admiral Julie Parker received a classified transmission, and her expression grew serious as she read it. Danny asked if there was a problem. Julie explained that long-range sensors had detected an unknown fleet entering the outer edge of the solar system. The ships weren't Voxian, and their signatures didn't match any known species in the database. Danny asked how many ships were approaching. Julie said 20, and all of them were armed. They weren't responding to communication attempts. Danny moved his hand to his communicator and said he would alert the defense fleet immediately. Julie told him to make sure their people understood the rules of engagement. No firing unless fired upon first. Humans didn't start wars. They finished them. Within hours, every defensive position in the Sol system was manned and ready. Human warships moved to intercept the unknown fleet. On Earth, President Kim was briefed and he approved the standing rules of engagement. Defend if attacked, but attempt communication first and exhaust all peaceful options. Admiral Parker commanded the response from Unity Station. She broadcast on all frequencies toward the unknown vessels. She identified herself as Admiral Julie Parker of the United Earth Defense Force. She informed them they were approaching sovereign human territory and requested that they identify themselves and state their intentions. The response came in broken, heavily accented English. The voice identified himself as Commander Vax of the Crethon Empire. He stated that they had come to evaluate the species that defeated the Voxian Collective. Julie corrected him and said the Collective wasn't defeated. Humans had negotiated a treaty. Commander Vax dismissed this as